What is up, everyone? Welcome to another edition of the Roster Reconstruction podcast. I'm your host, Corban Ford. You can follow me on Twitter at CorbanNBA. I want to take the time to first apologize to my guests and, well, those listening, because this show, while timely, also should have been out a lot earlier, like namely almost 3 weeks ago. And between Spotify platform issues, timing, all of the things, we didn't get it out in time, but we are getting it out now. So please sit back and enjoy. It's a really good one. None of the information is outdated. If anything, I think it's more timely now, just given what we've seen from the combine, the kind of fallout from that. Not negative, but just the fallout from that, and moving forward to the actual draft coming up here in just over a month. So it's Eric Weiss, a guy who's been working in basketball for years, on the forefront of some really cool projects, one of the greats of Swish theory. We have a very, very, very fun, deep dive conversation on nearly all aspects of draft philosophy. Without actually diving into the actual players of this class, that'll be for future shows, but I think this really serves as like the primer for those kind of conversations with more of a master lens to kind of look into that. So really happy to have had him on. I want to thank him again for his time and insight. I look forward to having him on again in a future show. But yeah, it's a lot of content to break down and listen to. It definitely had me going, wow, several times in the midst of like actively conducting this interview, this podcast with Eric, and I greatly enjoyed it. So definitely make sure, again, enjoy it as well. Reach out any feedback y'all have. Check out Swish Theory at Swish Theory, swishtheory.com. Like I said, on Twitter at CorbanNBA. Eric Weiss on Twitter as well. If I remember, it's Eric Weiss _SA. I feel like I got that right, but we're going to do double check in real time. Yeah, I got it right. Look at me. So definitely make sure to do that. Eric Weiss, ERIC WEISS _SA to find his great content and contributions as well to Swish Theory. So definitely make sure to check all that out. Really appreciate y'all. Take care. Have a good one. I'm Frosty. Y'all stay frosty and enjoy a great, great show. Here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Roster Reconstruction podcast. I'm your host, Corban Ford. The show, as you know, is part of the Swish Theory Podcast Network, so check them out at Swish Theory on Twitter, swishtheory.com. A lot of great NBA draft content, team, player and team evaluation content, all sorts of great stuff. Happy to be a part of their group, and I'm actually happy to bring on a fellow member of said group here to be a guest on this episode of the show. Eric Weiss. You can follow him on Twitter at Eric Weiss _SA. If you're listening, can't see it, it's ERIC WEISS _SA. He does a lot in basketball. We're actually about to find out just all that he does. But before we even do that, Eric, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing pretty well, Corban. Thanks for having me on.
We made it happen. Yes, I know. I appreciate you. I've been trying to get this guy on for a while, and I'm like, Eric, I need you. And then I disappear, or my schedule doesn't work, or our schedule's conflicted, and it finally happened. So here we are. But Eric, I did mention, a fellow member of Swish Theory with myself, and you have a lot behind the scenes in terms of basketball. And I know there's still a lot cooking behind the scenes that maybe can't be shared, but can you kind of give us some insight into, your relationship with basketball, kind of how you got into your field as you are now, and a little bit of what you do?
Yeah, no, interesting, right? Like I started getting into, I guess we'll call it professional, but like a career-oriented focus in basketball way back in 2003. And for those of us who were like 7 years old at that point in time, the internet was very new. And I really, really wanted a job that would allow me to not just have 2 weeks paid vacation and have to show up, which is now called remote work, which is common everywhere. So like, I think that was my biggest focus coming out of school. Is I have a lot of friends all over the place. I love sports, but it really was the internet that made me start thinking about which of my passions I could focus on that would allow me to basically like pack up my laptop and work wherever I wanted to be. So that's kind of the origin, and setting the time frame is important too, because what that led to was an impromptu direct message from I think it was on the Real GM message boards from Jonathan Gavoni from Draft Express, who was looking for writers,
Wow.
Draft City at that time. I had written a proposal for a marketing internship for the Celtics. And it was a writing sample, and I just forwarded it to him, and he reached back out to me, and he said, "This is great." We decided to meet up at, I think there was the second inaugural Vegas Summer League. And at that point in time, that was only in the ancillary gym, and it was only like league people and then like the occasional random person like townie that like cruised in, but it was basically a professional convention at that point instead of the spectacle. And that was the plan, was we had credentials and we were just going to cover the shit out of like the summer league, which we did, writing quarter by quarter breakdown, or excuse me, half by half breakdowns of every single game. And just, fast forwarding, like obviously I picked, luck is involved with that. We had good foundational contacts in Jason Levian and David Thorpe, who were repping Udonis Haslam at that point in time. And that opened a lot of doors for us. And then just hard work, having the focus on the internet. And then my son is going nuts because he has to take a nap. That led the next year to another one of my cohorts, Andy Graham, who was I think the first official employee of Synergy at that time, recruited out of Arizona State. He had reached out to John and I about this new product called Synergy. And we had already had a good rapport on the website from agents and a lot of family members and players, because it was kind of this novel thing. Now everyone has a mock draft, but back then, like that wasn't that common. So it got a lot of attention. Plus there was probably like 3 pages if you typed in NBA draft, like 3 total search pages. So, a different time. But once we had access to Synergy, I went and had a meeting with the founder of Synergy, Garrick Barr, and Andy in Vegas. Took a review, brought it back to John, and I said, "Hey, this is like a game changer." And it was. All of a sudden, I can say we were the first media source to start incorporating Synergy statistics into publications. And I mean, everything that you saw that was written at that point in time was just vibes, basically, right? It was just all qualitative, like, not that it was bad, but like you couldn't have that level of specificity, right? Let alone pulling video and doing any of that stuff, which, JavaScript evolved into, more video mixing. So did that for a long time, about 4 years. And then we were trying to figure out how to monetize. And I had an opportunity. As I was looking at this stuff, I really focused on the mental game and trying to understand more. My father's a clinical psychologist, so this was obviously, something that was familiar to me conceptually. And then just starting to think about it in the context of, hey, we need, some kind of professional differentiator. I started specializing in trying to understand more about how behavioral psychology and industrial psychology are used in corporate stuff. That led to a consultancy that I ran for 20 years. The pandemic killed that off while I was in the middle of building the app that you are familiar with right now, as I was trying to self-finance, and that was rough. And then I switched over, bringing back Andy Graham again. He had been working on a coaching software platform, which he had had some great success on with some initial NBA teams. And I've actually been working as my official capacity as director of learning for Luceo Sports for the last 3 years doing that. And we've been growing pretty rapidly at the high school and youth level. And we have a number of collegiate teams that have been coming on board. And that's mostly focused on one of my biggest interest areas, which is how the game, how information is structured from a learning perspective, right? Because I think that that's one of the biggest market inefficiencies in the sport, is not the quality of information, but how it's packaged and how it's delivered in a way to optimize information retention, which is teaching, which is education. And there's plenty of great education technology, which has gotten a lot more popular since the pandemic, which is, I don't want to say it was a good thing. It was obviously awful, but if you're looking at silver linings, a growing awareness of how online education can actually benefit people in remote learning. And then that's kind of powered me through to where I am today. So a lifetime in sports technology, starting with like media as a foundation, but a real interest in like education and understanding of like more than just what we see, right, when we watch the games.
Wow. So basically, you said more of that under, what do they call it? Like under the hood type of analysis of the game in terms of that intellectual, like intuitive kind of insight there.
We talk about process all the time, right? So this is a good analogy. So there's like the process of evaluation goes deeper than just like that basketball context, right? Like process is
Mhm.
the structure of education itself and learning. And so like being able and research, right? Like all of these things, we tend to be, I think one of the biggest places is basketball tends to be uh, fairly limited in range, right? In terms of just the kind of diversity of input from different fields and different backgrounds. Like it's getting better, but it's still
Mhm.
limited, and some of that stuff comes with problems too. I mean, one of the first things I came up in the analytics era, I guess, or whatever, but that created an entire other dichotomy between like, you know, like there's all these layers. And so now we're getting, you know, data scientists. We also have like sports science and medicine is increasing. Obviously, teams all employ some kind of mental health professional, and the league has that. When I was starting, there was maybe 2 teams that had a full-time person, and most people just had some local person on retainer, right? Like there's so
Wow.
many elements that are evolving, but at the end of the day, I think the the biggest thing is the process of collecting information and then disseminating that information in a way that makes it easier to understand and easier to from a player standpoint retain, right? Just like any
Mhm.
learner, so they can execute better by making sure that they have the answers right at their fingertips.
Wow. No, that does make a lot of sense. And I love the analogy in terms of, like you said, that the application of that and using the rather limited range, but the exploration of that. I think it's kind of funny. You mentioned how like you got people on retainer, and now like you look at, you know, team rosters, not just the players, but like coaching staff and developmental staff. And it goes like 10 deep, 12 deep, like it's very extensive. And so I think you're right. Like the amount of attention given to understanding different aspects of the game and on a different level entirely is so much more expansive than was before.
Yeah, and the size and scope of organizations, like just basketball ops,
Yeah.
whatever umbrella that falls under, is like orders of magnitude larger than when I started, right? When it was just a very small group of people that were doing all the things, the division of labor and the just like the breadth of different things that go into operations has just evolved more in line with like corporate, right? We always you basketball as a business, another easy analogy,
Yep.
right? Well, like explore what that means. It's not just about getting traded and doing whatever. It's just like these are billion-dollar entities, and there are corporate best practices that go into running like organizations of that caliber. And basketball spent a lot of time, you know, I personally believe just kind of like romanticizing the idea that we're still just like, you know, Hoosier style, like, well, like the game is it's like hermetically sealed in the high school land, right? And it's just like, oh no, it's just
Yes.
it can be the same. They're just better talent. And really what this is just a slow evolution into, you know, just kind of real business practices across the board. And that's what you see when you see all of these expanding, you know, new roles and new technologies and new inputs. And I think that's what the most fascinating element is like in that, how does the core, the expertise of the subject matter experts, the coaching, the players, the scouts, how do their processes evolve in order to take advantage of all of the utilities that exist in order to create better learning, right? And across the board to be more informed. And I think that is the most interesting part of the process. It's not necessarily the one element of that is analytics, which is the first, you know, I was one of the people that went to whatever the 10 first Sloan sports
So
conferences or whatever.
mhm.
Those early ones were also very small in one room or two. But like the actual qualitative part, the evaluation part, right? Like numbers are great and stats are awesome and tracking is great. But this whole stats versus film thing, it's not necessarily just eyeball tests versus statistics. It's processing what you're seeing and recording that information, right? Qualitative information in a way that you can use in order to better access that information to learn when you're looking back, and also educating pushing forward, so you know exactly like you're categorizing what you're seeing in a way that allows you to leverage it better, to learn like self-evaluation, learn from your own patterns, and also projecting evaluations onto other things by using that past history. Like a lot of this, and then how you communicate that information, right? So it's digestible to whatever audience is receiving. I'd say that falls into development, right? But like that's the most interesting thing. I still love the draft and I still love player development. I'm still a huge, like NBA and like overall basketball, like, nerd. And I love the game, but trying to understand ways in which it can improve has always been my biggest motivator for getting engaged.
Which is really cool. And again, thank you for like kind of detailing that journey and exploration. And you touched on it perfectly, like the next segue in our conversation here, which is kind of taking that evolution in terms of analysis, in terms of development, in terms of how we approach the game, and kind of turning an eye of that to the draft, right? And getting a little bit of talk on draft philosophy and evaluation, because we are, on the show notes here of the roster construction show, we are doing, getting more into kind of draft analysis, right? And recently we've gone from, you just discussed it earlier, the evolution in terms of how we look at young players in the league, how we look at prospects, how we look at, draft picks and everything. You can turn that to, the rise of NBA video games and things like that make us think that draft picks are just candy, or whether we look at, certain players like, oh, he's only 19 or whatever the case may be, these larger kind of thinking pieces around the way we evaluate young prospects, to the point that now we have a draft that used to be a one-night event now becoming a two-night spectacular type of thing, right? And so I guess I want to talk to you more about this and just draft philosophy in terms of how do you take some of the bigger notes that you have in terms of evaluating players and look at it from, okay, we have X person coming into the league, that could potentially be a big piece for said franchise, but we're trying to chart a developmental track for this player, what their high-end outcome is, what we think their immediate impact would be. How do we kind of grapple with some of these bigger points when it comes to looking at the draft and players in relation to maybe a deeper than surface level look at them?
Yeah, and I'd say, at least in the circles we swim in, surface level looks are not a problem. It's just looking, it's where you go deep, right? And also where you go wide. And understanding, knowing what you don't know, right? And trying to understand more about those factors that you have no control over, right? And I think that's one of the things, like to boil this into two big bins, I'd say the first thing I say is avoiding evaluation bias. And what I mean by that is over-indexing on the evaluation of the prospect in terms of the confidence of outcome, if that makes sense, right? And the second part of that is understanding development context, because the thing that most, don't want to speak for all people here, but I think that that's most common that you feel like you can control is using your experiential history and applying it to the individual player and having a false sense of confidence on what that player is going to be able to ultimately accomplish, because you feel like what that person's skill level is and you've spent all that time, and that's great, but there are a lot of missing elements to that process that are ultimately going to feed in, and the development context is the other huge half of that. But there's also elements to the evaluation process. So I'll start with the evaluation process the way I see it. And the first thing I think you got to look at is understanding historical outcomes. And that's starting with the probabilities, right? Like, I think that when we talk about tiers of players and we're trying, the dialogue has evolved and the level of depth and skill evaluation has evolved. But the danger in that is you're getting more information without necessarily sorting it in a way that you can make sense of it. So I love, I bring up micro skills all the time. A lot of what we're building into the evaluation app, like, it takes account archetypes and all this other stuff, but like, it has to be organized in a way that is applicable going forward, right? Like, you need to be able to organize your information so it continues to feed forward. And I'd say the probabilities, starting off simply just as a humbling, kind of sanity check is you got to look at like, no matter what you think, the level of evenness of outcomes. If you I tend to bin the draft in like 6 sections because you could argue, but in terms of outcomes, there tends to be like if you're talking about actual tiers, performance outcome tiers, 5-year career outcomes, that makes the most sense. But if you start to eliminate guys that didn't play and guys that are in the end of the bench, and you keep in mind the concept of sunk cost fallacy, right? The heuristic that like a first round pick is going to get, like a top 10 pick is going to get more opportunities because there's a baked in value for that outcome. So if you start to eliminate the guys that don't play, assuming that that's going to go up because the further you get in the draft, and that's not about talent, like the bottom end outcomes are less about talent and more about opportunity. Then you start looking at like your bench or whatever, your rotation and your starter and your star level stuff. And there is a lot of evenness when you start getting in there. And the reason I bring that up is because it's bell curve principle, right? Like when you redistribute, the NBA is its own closed group of talent. And in any sample group of individuals, there's going to be people in like the 99th percentile and people in the 0 percentile. Like all NBA guys might be in the 90th percentile for like athletes in a normal distribution, right? Across all human beings. But of NBA players, everyone can't be a freak athlete, right? Like there's like, you can be a freak athlete versus us, but not against your peer group.
Yeah.
And so the reason that I keep that in mind and like knowing the probabilities is when you look at the evenness of outcomes in terms of guys that become rotation players or starters or stars and seeing how even that is outside of the top 10, you really start to like be able to reinforce and remember, it's like, hey, these guys aren't really that different. So when we're grading an individual and we're saying, oh yeah, well, he's like a tier 2 prospect and whatever, and this guy's a tier 3 or whatever, realizing that like, at the end of the day, looking back to, I just did before we came on to 2000, just to check like the adjustments, like there isn't that much of a difference in talent. Guys can have certain skills that are more ready. Guys can be more developmentally behind. Some guys have better physical attributes, but in terms of real separation, like guys that are just like cream in terms of potential, not in terms of however we tier them with like the entire smorgasbord of whatever goes into determining whether a guy, is a top tier prospect or not, but just knowing what the potential development is of that person. Most of these guys are in the same bandwidth, right? A majority of the sample group is going to be between the 25th percentile and the 75th, right? Like that is the bulk of everybody has varied. And that's how guys like, I don't know, like Steve Nash's or any of these like random like guys that you're like, well, it's like people are capable of superseding like marginal differences. And so I think we fetishize sometimes the like just how significant the advantage is that somebody has once we get, in certain years, like maybe this draft year, there might not be any guy in this draft that has any appreciable like knock over advantage. Like they're LeBron's, like these like Wembanyama, those are special circumstances, but most years you might have 2 or 3 guys tops that are just have a ridiculous competitive advantage like over the field that can't be made up, I guess would be the short way to say it, right? And so keeping that in mind and knowing that like there's probably a lot of fungibility in that space is a huge thing to keep in mind. And then going from there, then you got to get into your draft history and go into specifics. And like I say, like identify busts and steals. This is getting more popular, like these redrafts, right?
Yeah, like, I'm big on that myself. Yeah.
Redrafts are great. Should never be done before year 3. I think it's completely just media fodder if you're doing it 1 year later. But one of the disturbing things, which is like, I don't even know if it's like reverse confirmation bias or whatever it is, or self confirmation bias, but like I tend to read these redrafts and there tends to be, again, a lot of focus on the evaluation. What did I get wrong? Like, and the assumption on that is a misevaluation of the person without taking into account the organization. And that will like start to turn to that development context stuff because there's so much because of how narrow the difference is, right? And that bell curve principle, there are so many things that are environmentally driven that can like, I usually use this example. What if you get drafted and then, your team signs a guy at your position to a 3-year, $60 million contract, right?
We've
what
seen
if
that
the
several
stage
times.
of the organization is in like win now mode and you're you don't have any foundational skills, which we'll get into in like skill development. So you're like a theoretically awesome player, but you have no entry level position like on this team. Like there's so many things that have nothing to do with the evaluation of the prospect's latent ability by himself that can impact outcomes. So that would be like, that's the holistic view for me for avoiding evaluation bias. And then the second part of that is be wary of the details, which we talked about a little. This is actually what the Crowd Scout thing is all about. But like, there tends to be a lot of like NBA focused analysts and draft focused analysts, and there's cross pollination, but in terms of like that granularity, I think that I don't see a ton of that where when I look at this and taking another corporate context, I'm looking at the evaluation of incoming prospects, right? I've worked in basically hiring and HR for my whole life, right? I always said that I do cool HR when I had friends and family that asked what I did. I'm like, essentially scouting and player development is just human resource management, but it's fun, right? So like it's cool HR. But like there are principles from that are really helpful. And I think one of them and my wife works for a large tech company and is constantly doing performance reviews also. So I'm constantly being exposed to this, and we're always talking about the strengths and weaknesses. But one of the things that's really interesting is as positionless basketball has evolved and roles are less easily defined, I would say cannot be defined by historical positions. Defining roles and skill criteria is important because that's how all hiring best practices work in, we'll call it the real world, right? Like you have to know what you're projecting into. And in order to do that, you have to have a very detailed process of evaluating the people that have the job, right? Before I think you can do a super effective job at evaluating the people who want the job. And that's the thing. When I look at skill evaluation, all these things are relevant skills, but have they been packaged and ordered and understood in a context of like, well, what job needs what skills and what are the qualifications of this individual into a particular track, instead of cherry picking tools in a bag and being like, oh, this guy's got all the tools. I'm like, yeah, but how do they sort, right? Like their different jobs require different tools. And if you just have just an assortment of different stuff, I don't necessarily know if you're like an architect or a plumber or whatever. It's just a big mess of equipment, right? And so like being able to figure out what those roles and skill criteria are helps clarify what the job requirements are. And then being able to what I really like the NFL. I don't know if you're a big NFL guy.
I kind of dabble, not super heavy in it, but I definitely watch enough to. I'm a Saints guy, so I watch.
I was a scholarship football athlete, just to toot my own horn, from a million years ago.
Oh, wow,
so
man.
Football is. My dad was way out ahead. He met the CTE guy and he said, "Don't play that." And so I was like, "Okay, sounds legit." Also didn't want to be a punching bag. I was not going to play. I was going to be a GPA like human practice dummy. So I'm not going to be like, yeah, I was going to go pro. I'm just saying football is in my background. I love the way that they grade, going back to tiers. And this goes very well back to that point of establishing roles and skill criteria, because when I see NBA tiers, I say, it like process over vibes, right? Where it's like this subjective, like tier 1, tier 2. It's like, we haven't really fully articulated what job we're projecting a certain player into. Not saying that you can't switch jobs or whatever, but we haven't really made sense of the player from a, like, what is the applicable, like, what is the package, right? And where is that package best applied? And then not being able to then grade that individual in a way where the NFL does, where you have the, they do it off of a 10-point scale, right? And you have all these numbers, if you see it, where the guy's like a 6.73 and there's a bracket that's like, this guy projects as a future star. Like, I really would love NBA to pick up on that same process, because that's a process of evaluating your current job holders on a set of criteria, rating the skill thresholds in those criteria, right? And then applying that same grading process onto the upcoming prospects to at least create a standardized evaluation that would then establish, kind of a qualitative estimate of what you're projecting. Not to say that it's going to be accurate, but it's getting closer to at least baselining what the expectations are. And I think that is something that NFL teams do very well. That's something that's very familiar in the corporate world. And that's something where I think that's a big part of how you also want to see. I just talked about this with Matt the other day while I was getting right after you and I talked, and it was like kind of pumping this. I sent him a link to one of the articles talking about the NFL grading process, but it's really nice to also be able to establish a delta between players, right? Where we stack rank these guys. We're like, oh, he's first, and maybe we have a tier, and some people will put colors on it, but we don't know if a guy is like Alexander Sarr seems to be the consensus, right? Like Jonathan going back that just released the whatever the invite thing and the whole process. So like the fact that he ended up number one is a pretty solid indicator that at this point in the draft process, Alexander Sarr is getting a lot of like league consensus on that. However, we don't have an associated grade. We don't know he's like, hey, so he's the number one guy. But is he at 9.6? Like whatever. Wembanyama probably would have scored as like a 9.4 or whatever. He would have been one of these like unicorn prospects on the NFL scale.
Upper tier. Yes.
Most guys are going to be sub 8, right? Like, and having that ability to look and be like, oh, well, there's a tier, but that first tier has a cutoff range between like 9.9 and like 8. And so you're grading, you're like, well, like defining what a tier is and then having bandwidth within that tier to then cross compare not only players in the same tier, but also play like what's like is the guy just outside of tier 1, right? Like I really like the idea of process space. And this is analytics, but this is the analytics of watching film or watching a player live and translating your qualitative observations into just something like you're just checking stuff on a box. You're like, you're forcing what your eyes are seeing to then translate into some kind of like concrete evaluation criteria, right? I'm just taking what I saw, I've identified it, and I have to give it some kind of valuation, right? And on a scale that I understand, right? That is a process-based approach to taking the film side of this equation, or the eyeball test side of this equation, and then adding process to basically close the gap and make more effective arguments against the analytics department, who's like, well, the numbers say this. It's like, well, like, can we get a little bit closer on that divide? And then subsequently that kind of process really helps on the qualitative evaluation side, because now you can go back through your stuff. You have checklist items that are much easier to cross compare off of, right? And then you can go into the situational stuff, which we'll go into next. But that's my avoiding the valuation bias in a nutshell. It's understanding historical outcomes and being wary of details, right? And grading off of specific criteria, right? Details. Did you read Range?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
That whole thing where like heart-related deaths or heart surgery-related deaths go down or whatever when all the heart surgeons are at the convention. Like,
interesting,
fascinating,
but like, yeah, it was. It again, like the way you said, like the way it's a big like. I guess they say the devil in the details, but not getting lost in said details, like you were saying in that way, because it is easy to go down. I mean, we've all done it. A wormhole rabbit hole of like, okay, this player, we've seen this type before, this and that, and their jump shot, like guys who, hit 7, threes a game on 40% accuracy in college are Steph Curry, this guy. So, putting this all together, he's going to be a star. And it's like, okay, great. But we haven't looked at the defense. He's also 6'1", and like all the other like details.
We don't even know where he's going yet. The biggest, we have no idea what environment he is going to be asked to do any of these things in, right? And that's why I studied the other side, like the mental part of it from my father, which was interesting, which was also, he's a relationship therapist, that's his specialty, but he's consulted in like corporate hiring things forever. So that's how I got into it. But like, that was my first interesting thing, is realizing, where relationships typically go wrong is when, in the absence of understanding the other person's perspective, right? The absence of me understanding you and how you think and value things and whatever, we project our own values into the behaviors that we observe, right? So we make false assumptions about Corban's motivation for doing X, Y, and Z because I am going to filter it through the lens of why I would have done X, Y, and Z, right? And so when you apply that to an evaluation context too, you're like, you don't really understand, like when you're moving a person to an entirely new situation, like whoever that person is now going to have different environmental factors acting on them, which, like, if you believe in the structure and agency principle, right? Like the behavior is dictated by the person and the situation. And if the situation completely changes, behavior can change,
Also,
which is
like
in draft parlance for anybody that's glazing over, something that Mike Schmitz told me, which like resonated very strongly with the kind of overall philosophy of that kind of psychology, is you want to watch guys in different development environments, right? Like the easiest prospects to evaluate, unfortunately, are typically the guys that play in like USA basketball and have all these like high level things, because they're playing in a bunch of different team contexts with different responsibilities and different like teammate, like all of these things and different factors. And it's much easier to identify constants when you're changing the variable, like the environmental variable, right? That scientific process match with scouting, right? It's much easier to scout a guy when you've seen him do stuff in a bunch of places, and then you've seen certain things that are through points, right? That are like, oh, that's the same every time. I've used this example. Yeah, you probably have a player that you can like. I'll turn this around on you. Who's a player that you were confident in, that you were higher on than someone else because you just had a better sense of what they, of who they were?
Yeah, so it's funny you bring this up. I'm going to ask you, and it leads right to my next question on player comps. But I remember 2012, I think 2011, DeMarcus Cousins.
Yeah.
I saw in my mind like more like a Derek Coleman for the modern age. Like that was how I remember like putting my notes in terms of like, skilled. I mean, Derek Coleman I think was left-handed, but skilled in the post, some like semblance. Derek, and I was really happy it happened. It didn't happen a lot in college at all, but I really thought that based off the jump shot that Cousins would be able to stretch to three. I didn't think it'd be like super, 40% 3-point shooting, but I thought he'd have like a decent 3-point shot. I remember watching, I was young, but I remember watching Derek Coleman with like the 76ers and like being, he was kind of big at that point, but being a guy inside outside type guy. I drew some very slight parallels between the temperament and attitude of the two. And I was like, boom, there it is. And it's been a decade now. And I've still felt like really good about that, even though totally different players, as it obviously turned out. But in my mind, 6'11", stocky, inside outside guys. And I did a little bit of like projecting, okay, I think his shooting will be good, yada, yada. That was probably the best one I had. Ant was another one I felt really good about because I thought, again, looking at the physical profile, looking at the alpha scoring, like, and I guess is another question for later about like, I gravitate to a type of player. And I know this about myself. And so, in my mind, 6'4", 6'5", strong shooting guard, can you play a little bit of combo guard? Like in my head, can you be a primary initiator-ish type of guy where you can take on a higher share of the offensive usage and in compensation for that, just have a more defensive minded group and a guy that kind of makes some easier shots for you. Like those are the kind of guys I gravitate towards. So when the stuff about Anthony Edwards came about, his whole, does he want to win or whatever, or does not he win? Is he really focused about basketball? I'm like, yeah, he is, of course. But I'm also willfully, admitting to my own bias in that he's my type of guy where he's not doing that, so yeah, those are maybe two examples I have of guys that I was higher on based off my own internal bias or confirmation.
Yeah, and that's also a good one. I should probably add that to my list, is like, be aware of the players you're most likely to fall in love with. Because there's definitely like back when I was in my Draft Express days, I like to toot my own horn a little bit, saying that I could see positionless basketball coming, but it was more my superpowers. I just didn't give a shit about these guys that were called tweeners. I would look at like a small forward, power forward specifically, but shooting guard, point guard. That took a little longer, but it was a hand checking. But the guys that were strong enough to do stuff, and it was always like, well, he's not like, didn't fit like the power forward mold or was like too big. I was I totally didn't care. I was always into this, like David West was like a big player. I mean, he was obviously awesome as Xavier, but there was a lot of questions at the time of whether or not he would effectively be able to play like the 4, right? And there's a bunch of Leon Poe before he got hurt was a big guy that I loved, and these guys were undersized at that time. Believe it or not. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. How you're like he's 6'8" and he's strong, but like back then, if you weren't like 6'11", I mean, this is the transition from the era where there was 2 giant, what would be like centers in the league now played your 2 front court positions, right? So these like smaller, like agile guys were like instantly looked at as like questionable, when I was just like, well, what is that other dude going to do to defend that guy, right? And I was totally like, well, they have all these scoring things. I'm like, well, what can the other guy do? And that never used to be the conversation. But I did tend to fall in love with a lot of those, that is my thing. Like I do gravitate to those guys that as soon as I see something, questions about what position they play or whatever, my mind wants to go into prove that player can do it mode versus like being receptive to the criticism, because that's like a very strong bias for me from my own history when that's all I heard. And I would, I can go into autopilot and be like, oh, the consensus must be wrong. Let me go spend all my energy trying to figure out why they're wrong versus like, let's hear what's being said and peel apart the layers first.
Going from that, how do you kind of contextualize and balance that bias? Because in some cases, like, you have like I guess in developmental staff, things of the nature, like players or people who are focused on that type of player, right? And okay, you have your guard gurus or your big man whisperers. You get these phrases thrown around because that is their specialization, right? How do you kind of balance, like, you like you said, each of our innate, there we go, biases that we may have after a while of gathering data, collecting intel on these type of players, on these type of, not even players, but let's say archetypes, and changing that from, okay, maybe this is outside of my, like, or maybe like you said, maybe this is something I should be more open to considering when it comes to, okay, some very real flaws that I'm not seeing because I'm so used to watching this player in this specific context.
Yep. I think that really, and this is obviously biased because this is my process, but like, I think that's where it's really important to have those criteria spelled out and having a way to basically sort and store that information, because you can go through your you need to be able to accrue what I said. I think at the beginning I said like self-evaluation, right? Like the ability, but if you're going to effectively evaluate your own blind spots or whatever, for me forever too, I'll just fully say that it's like, and it's still a weakness that I work on all the time, was team defense. Like I was always good at like, I could tell if a guy could play man defense and what he could do, but like really understanding some of the limitations on a guy's awareness on that side, I'd be like, I'm definitely an offense bias. And do you suck at defense or not from a just like purely like engagement and ability to contain your guy standpoint? And I would always just kind of hand wave, a lot of the team stuff also, because I'd be like, well, it depends on motivation and all these other things, which is true, but there are physical limitations. But I think that the biggest thing is when you have all the criteria and you have a means of which to store that information, you can always look back and you can start to see simple things like, have I been ignoring certain like things, right? Like I have just not been paying attention on them. That's part of like tracking what you're doing, is like, where am I focusing on, right? Am I doing 90% of my draft work or whatever, or my player evaluation work on those like forwards or on offense, right? Versus defense. Like how am I balancing out my evaluation time? And the second part of that is going back into those bins basically and reevaluating and saying, okay, what am I missing? And then adding to that when new information comes in and new players, and then going back through the process of evaluation on players that you've already evaluated. And that ties back into the whole idea that like, I think the evaluation process of any prospect needs to carry through at least 3 years into their NBA career. Ideally 5, I think, is the best based on like kind of outcome stabilization. Like a majority of players, basically just stabilized by year 5, with the exception of like guys like Kyle Lowry and some of these strange outliers that, have bumps, but which are also fascinating case studies. But like keeping track of your process is going to inform your ability to do the job better going forward. If you just read word soup stuff, right? Like I love reading articles and it's great, but if like it's harder to put your finger on specifics if you're not more methodical about like, hey, how have I gone through all these things? Where am I spending most of my time? Where am I like the weakest? And then really getting into narrow verticals in that instead of just trying to like look at a player and then go back into an analysis, like a synopsis of the player, right? Which is what a scouting report is. And then try to figure out, you need to track the process that goes into the analysis, right? In order to create better analysis going forward, because analysis just has so many feeders, right? Like all the things that go into making making one of these great articles. There's like so many steps in there. And so like keeping track of that is extremely important, because if you don't, you can't go look back and you can't find where it's not as easy to find the weak points, right, in that process and address them specifically.
Okay, so it's really more of that. I guess the word nuance comes to mind in terms of balancing the two, and like you said, I like the spill over into the scouting reports too, because I mean even now I'm doing a lot more of watching a lot of film on a player to then write an article on said player and using numbers and trying to balance. And I'll throw out. In fact, let's throw out a player specific example that you're kind of familiar with. We were talking before going on live on the show of the 2015 draft, and I am familiar, with that one. Obviously, D'Lo, and I think it was a lot of trade. Like it was a lot of trade picks thrown around for like guys like Justice Winslow and things of that nature, or Stanley Johnson and like those type of players. But let's use D'Angelo Russell for an example, right? Like we're in a space where played in Ohio State, watch a lot of film on the guy. That he's a good shooter. He has a lot of, at the time, I think what was kind of looked past was, maybe not the quickest of foot, the physical profile or the weaknesses therein, but you see electric shooting, you see next level passing. You see teams that needed a guard at the time. I mean, you're looking at the Lakers, you're looking at other squads as well, and where he could fit in. Like, how do you take, like using him as a case study here, kind of take a player from a medium side or a scouting perspective and contextualize, this is the skills he brings to the table, and without losing sight of, team context is important, his fit's important. We've seen that because on the teams he's been in his actual NBA career, the same skills he's had has been great. Very good passer, very good shooter, but you do have to cover for him defensively. There has to be a certain type of team construct there. He's maybe not your go-to guy all the time because his hot streaks are hot, but when he's cold, right? And so, and those things hadn't really changed much from college. It's just the interpretation of said skills during that time.
Yeah, no, and he's a fascinating example because I was intimately involved in his draft process. There was a lot of interesting stuff, which I can't talk about, but what I can talk about kind of goes back in the development context. And so like these three kind of principles, I won't go yard on them. We'll see if we can integrate these into kind of case point examples, but he's a great one. So I look at development context in terms of three main things: foundational skills, applied skills, and situational skills. Foundational skills is just like what's in the bag, what's missing, and what's the order of priority for development, right? And I call them foundational because like this is just like your raw potential, and also like figuring out, when I say a player needs a foundation, or it's like what are you starting with, right? Paul Millsap's older, but he was I did an awesome interview, which I can't find the audio for anymore because his technology is way too old. It's like 800 computers ago, but I had interviewed him after his like first year. Right. And he talked about this so much. And obviously Paul Millsap was like he was like an undersized center when he came in right out of Louisiana Tech. And he evolved into like a 3-point shooting, like four, right? Like it was like complete metamorphosis from what he did. But I'll never forget this that's definitely one of the foundational like elements of my own process. Hearing him is he's like, oh yeah. And he had Jerry Sloan for coach too, right? Old school as it gets, like hard ass. He's like, I was talking to him about, going from year 1 to year 2 and what he was doing and like his experience. And basically he's like, well, I'm this is not word for word, but he basically was like, I gave Jerry what he needed from me. And then the off season was about like working on stuff that I wanted to do going forward. And then figuring out when to pepper in little snippets of that from the expectations, right? Saying, okay, well, Jerry wants me to do this. I'm going to do that. Awesome. So I basically earn respect from the person that my boss, basically, who's in charge. And then I have my own career ambitions essentially, and I'm going to work on things that I can do, but then I will be smart about that and apply them judiciously while still maintaining the thing, so I can like expand my opportunities organically, versus a lot of players I think anchor on where they want to go and what they want to do, and they don't focus on creating the pathway, right? By figuring out that and coaches are bad at this too, because coaches will always want what they want, just like, anyone that's worked at bosses will typically want what they want. But there's a reason that companies have evolved to have one-on-ones and have all these career pathing stuff, because like there has to be space to figure out trajectories and then like where you can get experience to do that. And it was fascinating when Millsap said that to me. I was just like, wow, that's like the most mature. And I had no idea at that point. I was just like, I think he can play in the league and he might have like, a little jump shot. Like I was just intrigued by him because he was so undersized as a center, and he was one of my tweener guys. So I was like, I was going to talk to him, and I was like, man, that is some real good advice for people. Yeah. It's like, do the thing they want you to do and do it awesome, but then use that as currency and leverage to expand the role responsibilities, right? It's not a binary either or. It's like
no, you can do both.
And
that is, yeah.
And to tie back to D'Angelo, like that goes in. So like that's foundational skill building, right? It's like, what can you do to get your foot in the door, right? What skills are going to get you like your base level of opportunity to grow off of? The applied skills, which is like sequencing, I look at that as like reading the game. And this is where I think a lot of people miss on older prospects, was like, well, he's already as developed as he's going to get. I'm like, dude,
yes.
Like, you can have all of your foundational skills fully developed. Let's just say, I don't believe that's true for anybody 23 years old, but let's just say that like your whole bag is polished and it's great. It's all awesome.
Ready-made.
Knowing what to take out in what sequence based on your understanding of the game is going to make you, from a performance standpoint, infinitely more like the amount of bottom line perform, like getting more efficient in your shooting, putting up bigger stat, like all of that can be done without any foundational skill advancement, because you can learn. Zach LaVine is a perfect example. As I always am, like he's got one of the biggest bags there is, but he's not great. He's gotten better. DeMar DeRozan coincidentally was like this too for a long time, not knowing when to do what, even if you have all of the tools, like that is a huge part of development. So I put that in the applied skills development. And then situational stuff is I call it physical skills compatibility and mental skills compatibility. And this is where I'll tie it back to D'Angelo. It's like, okay, then it's like, what role are you in, right? And like, who is surrounding you? So is the job being made easier? Are the requirements for your role taking advantage of the best skills you have? Or are you being in business, they call it a promotion, a level above competency or whatever, right? Like, not like, sometimes people get put into a situation that like they're going to be less productive simply because the context is not conducive to being as good as they can be, right? Not because they're taking less shots or anything. It's like legitimately because like, hey, they need to like drive more than they can do shooting, but there's not enough spacing, like some basic stuff. Like there's
team context.
The 5 people all impact each other's ability to do the things they do best to their best level, right? And then the mental skills stuff is a little bit more subtle. And this is like some of the stuff like I interviewed D'Angelo at the McDonald's All-American game. He was not supposed to be a one and done guy, super cool guy. He's like very like artistic guy. He was like, I was like really pulling for him. I think that he had a lot of like chips on his shoulder and stuff about like the process. He definitely hadn't been brought up to be ready for the like quick limelight. And then he went to LA, and this was LA, like in the middle of their, infinite rebuilding, like craptastic mismanagement version of LA, right? It just was a grease fire, but you're in Los
Post-Kobe
Angeles.
years, or not even post-Kobe years.
The vacuum.
Yep.
And like not great, right? And then you're talking about somebody that has a lot to prove, has suddenly gotten all these accolades, is not necessarily mentally had the time to prepare for being the guy, because he had this this whirlwind one season at Ohio State that put him. I don't even think he was a first round projection. Like, I'm pretty sure he wasn't a first round projection going into that year. And then he ends up being the second overall pick, and he goes to a place that has no organizational structure, like that would help put any guardrails or define anything. And then he's put with a bunch of people a similar age, and they're all in the kind of like mercenary development situation where everybody, like Star Search, I used to call it, right? It's like, you're just like, oh, who's gonna win? Find out like next time on like LA's shooting guard, like option or whatever. Like, that's not great for certain people. Like certain people that are like, there's certain level. Like I think I'm gonna use LeBron as a skill stuff, but like Jimmy Butler, I guess, somebody that is like so regimented, so internally anal about like everything they do, and is just like a machine in terms of prep and whatever. Yeah, they can probably thrive in that because they have self-discipline. They don't need as much like conformity and structure to kind of figure out how to be the best version of themselves, how to make decisions on kind of all of those things at once when it's just like a blank slate. I think that D'Angelo going to LA like greatly impeded his like developmental progress. And then he got into it. Like, I don't think Brooklyn was necessarily any better. It was just, he had kind of learned from getting burned, right, in the situation that he was in. And so that taught him something. Like, D'Angelo's a fascinating case study of like constant exposures in the NBA, and like the contexts aren't always good, but his own learning curve and being able to be ready and coming full circle. And I was really rooting for him to have a better playoffs than he did. That's the one thing that's still missing, is consistent productivity on that level. But the fact that he was able to come full circle and come back to LA, come back with the level of pressure and expectation that a LeBron, like whatever, everything that comes with being on a team with LeBron, that's going to like the highest level of expectation professionally. I'm not talking about external. I'm just talking about like how you run shit, right? That's like Kobe and all this other, but you've just gone into the real zone. You're not in super happy fun time in like shitty lottery team land. This is like, we're business people. And
every shot's analyzed.
And him thriving, like having his best regular season statistically, and even by eyeball tests, like just played exceptionally good basketball. It took a notch up when there were some injuries and locked it in, but like he had been trending in that way before the trade. Also in Minnesota, he had been very quietly had improved on a lot of his and that's like his going back, his applied skill, his ability to apply what he did got much, much better. But that final part, that situational part, has not always worked in his favor. And I dare say it's almost never really worked in his favor, other than opportunity, which people say, oh, we got to start and he got paid. But I'm talking about like helping him be the best version of himself, not just giving him opportunity to get paid and get stats, but actually helping him grow. Like, I think that's why we've seen him be like, I've seen him progress so much over the last like 2.5 seasons, even though development curve wise, it doesn't make sense. I think he's really had a lot of roadblocks that he's had to learn from experientially. And it's a credit to him that he's continued. And I think that kind of rebel, I don't want to say rebel, but the kind of chip on the shoulder kind of like thing that hurt him at first, which is like, I'm not going to internalize any criticism or whatever. But I think that fight that he had through failure, right, opened his perceptivity to what he had to fix. And that fight never went away. So instead of giving up, which a lot of guys do when they don't get what they want, he continued to improve. And I love that for him.
He persevered.
Yeah. Yes. Perseverance. Like great player example of a guy that's been through like a fascinating case study too. If you're going to go through and like really keep track of like you said, like paying attention to the environmental context is huge. And looking at each situation and what that organization, right? Not just the skills of the players around them, but like, what's the direction of this? This is a rebuilding team starting from zero with a bunch of rookies that are like, I'm going to be the man. No, I'm going to be the man. And it's like, what did he jump into? It's like, rebuilding team that just blew up after a disastrous trade that doesn't necessarily know what's going on, right? And then it's like, then you go to like, did he go to Minnesota next, or did he go to? No, he went to the Golden State. Golden State was
Golden State, yeah,
exposure to real, and he wasn't ready for it, right? They quietly and respectively moved on, it's like as quickly as they were able to. It was a flip for Wiggins, but I think that was a huge touchstone. The fact that he was able to like learn in that context, like you saw it in Minnesota, even though Minnesota hadn't figured out what they were going to be like. Once Tim got there and started formulating that team, like his last part of the year there, he was outstanding. Like he had really like reached kind of the level that we saw this year, right? He had started really showing he was efficient. Joe Holbert actually pointed it out because I had stopped really paying attention. He's like, D'Lo's playing awesome. And I was like, oh, really? And I had to go in. I was like, oh, man, he's like way better than he used to be. He's like, he's just not this guy that I roll my eyes every time he's on the court. I'm like, oh, you're going to do dumb stuff that doesn't optimize like context. I'm like, oh, yeah, you're really playing pretty damn good. So,
yeah, he's definitely grown as a player. And I think it was something you said I wanted to touch on real quick before I forgot, which is, and it was just in the moment, like the chip on the shoulder of being a knock originally, but kind of using that to kind of keep himself focused and almost kind of resistant to the criticism, which again can be negative, but in his case also turned to a positive because he's able to kind of shine through that. I want to kind of throw in, I hear this so many times and I really don't know how to like what to make of it in terms of evaluation process, all of that, but you hear the word character thrown around a lot. And I know you have experienced that. I don't know like what you can share, just how you look at that word in terms of how you apply that to players, prospects, whatever you want to look at it in the draft process, and how important or not important is that? Because, you know, from somebody who's not really affiliated, I obviously know, you know, other people closer in those circles, but me, myself, not being there, I'm fortunate, I'm insulated from having to go, their character, outside of what I see on like the news or social media, whatever the case may be. But like, how much stock do you really put into that? How much stock should, in your own estimation, be put into that? Because, and I'm not even talking about like, obviously clear criminal activity, things of that sort, but just like whispers you hear about them not being great in the locker room, XYZ. I do a lot more work with AAU ball now. I see a lot of talented players who are like off the bench, kind of a-holes. And I'm like, oh, it's not great. Like, how do you kind of contextualize all of that?
Yeah, no, that's great. And that was obviously like a very specific specialization element, right? When I talked about team chemistry, but a lot of this stuff is understanding more about the person and then trying to understand the behavior based on the combination of the person and the situation, right? So when I hear character stuff, I roll my eyes instantaneously because I'm like, well, cool. I need to understand what that, like, where that comes from. This, you need details. Anytime you're going to get in this, and this is like back, you know, whatever, doing the background stuff is like huge. Like intel is like king, like any scouting person will tell you that, but like process there is lacking with a lot of organizations too, where it's like, oh, well, I heard something behavior related, right? Like, oh, well, the work ethic isn't the best, or is, you know, or the person's like moody and doesn't bring the same energy all the time or whatever. I always say stuff like, well, what if he hates his job? Or like, what if, like, what else, like separating behavior from the person, from character for me is the inherent, like, I don't know, values and ethics or whatever of the person. Behavior is how someone acts. Like, I've been an asshole plenty of times. You want to interview my wife, like, she can tell you, like, you know, like probably how many times I pissed her off this week. But but like, people have, you know, I didn't sleep well. Like, I'm not like clear on whatever. Like, so many things that go into what you see. I wasn't compatible with the people that I was working with or whatever. And it created a sense of agitation. Like, anytime you're going to get in the background work, it is absolutely like essential to get a diversity of opinions, right? Like, if you can't, like, ultimately you can collect, you know, for years, I collected like personality data, like just having guys take an assessment and then using it as basically forensic detective work to be like, oh, what is this telling me about how they're answering these questions and what these scales measure? And basically, can I map that back to intel and like circumstances and try to make sense of like, well, why did they do that? Right. And that came up so many, like, I cannot tell you, and that doesn't make that some kind of like perfect system, but I can say that I made a living for almost 2 decades, like simply asking better questions about like what was the motivation, instead of everyone's asking that, but they're not asking it. They're not collecting the information in a way to help. They were not, and it is still getting better, but like collecting information in a way conducive to answering that instead of doing that error of attribution thing again, where it's like, well, if you project the reason why based on like how you would have handled it or whatever, like if you start to fill in the blanks without like any kind of process of filling them in, right? If you just kind of like guesstimate why it happened, like you are going to make mistakes.
Well, they seem, yes.
Cousins was a great example. Bring it back to that one. So I went through another, obviously, because he was super talented and people were worried about his temper or whatever. So I had a lot of conversations over multiple years of his development. And the biggest thing, and this is where the personality data was helpful, because I also, as we got a lot of it, I was able to actually bin players into groups too, based on like shared characteristics and stuff. And when you started looking at the sample groups, a lot like how everyone goes on Bartovic, right? And you're like filtering and you look at like groups of players that fell within thresholds. I could do that with personality stuff, with, again, like stuff that these guys are sitting down. It's not the end all be all, but it's, you know, it's questions answered by these guys, right? And standardized, so I can have the patterns, and that can at least give me areas to look at. And Cousins fell into a group with a number of other players who had all shared one thing in common. I can say it too: Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and I cannot remember the little guard who used to play for LA and Phoenix and then finished up in Milwaukee.
I'm not. Oh goodness! No, I'm the Clippers, Lakers.
Clippers. He was a Clippers guy. Went down to Phoenix.
Eric Bledsoe.
Yeah, Eric Bledsoe.
Okay.
So one of the things that, like, first it was common sense, where I'm like, well, situation, like, and I use past historical stuff. I'm like, well, Kenyon Martin was a fiery guy, and then he calmed down. I'm like, Alonzo Mourning was always like Mr. Technical Foul guy, and then he calmed down. So like my working theorem was, what if this is just a byproduct of one, age and maturity, and then being compounded by two, increased frustrations. I'm like, I'm not saying he's not going to be fiery, but I'm like, are there other examples of guys that when they were younger and they were in different contexts, like they had less control over, right, like their emotions, and then what were the circumstances in the situations where they got better at that? And so my working theory was like, hey, don't subject him to a dysfunctional like King's clusterfuck like forever that's going to make anybody insane. Somebody that's already predisposed to like lose their mind is probably not going to do well there. And then when I looked at the parallels, like you wouldn't think that those 3 guys or 4 guys have a lot in common on surface, but this is kind of like the like do less kind of thing in range, right? Like the taking a more superficial view of things instead of getting lost in the like, well, they're not having anything common. I'm like, these people literally answered questions, like a ton of questions very similarly, that has enough statistical validity that you don't ignore it and be like, they have nothing in common. And what they all had in common experientially was that all of them were more volatile decision makers in volatile environments, right? Kawhi was supposed to be the bankable future bridge of San Antonio. And San Antonio is probably the best at gauging like personality and behavior based stuff. I'm like, a lot of what I did is just like similar to what their organizational tree does. Oklahoma City, this stuff's all evolved, obviously, but like at the time, I'm like, Kawhi decided to jump ship. Nobody saw that coming. It's like, then Paul George, same thing. They were going to rebuild Indiana, decided to jump ship. It's like Eric Bledsoe did the same thing. I'm like, I don't want to be here. We have a history of people. We have common sense stuff where we have experiential stuff, looking at guys that like had emotional issues and then, or whatever, and then stabilized and were able to channel that more effectively. And then you had these like contextual parallels from personality stuff that's like, oh, here are other people that made surprising decisions, right? Volatile decisions, like did not make like stable decisions, whatever, like did not make predictable, bankable decisions once the environment became unstable. And I'm like, cool. So my advice on Cousins was put him in a more stable environment. Let him focus his energy on like worrying about beating the other team instead of worrying about like losing all the time or guys messing. Like, I'm like, just make the team better. And he'll probably, as he ages, if he can just focus in on being the best him and not just being, that was a theory. So it's a very good example of like that process too, because like it does make a difference. And going back to your Intel thing, it's like, yeah, guys get labeled. Right. I've been part of these things before. It's like, man, you have to take it beyond that. You have to write down, well, what is it? What happened? Did you get both sides of the story? Did you get multiple opinions on this thing? Like what else could possibly, are there any other examples? Drew Holiday was the guy. Drew Holiday was the guy that had a myriad of, Drew Holiday's draft, I was consulting with 14 NBA teams, just to give you context, because lots of people will be like NBA consultant. Like at my peak, I was doing almost 2/3 of the league. Like I was doing this stuff. So I had a great wealth. And that's also very helpful because I got to talk to a lot of people. And I also got to see how different opinions would be on stuff that you would think that, oh, like what's the evaluation of this guy? And you learn very quickly, there's no universal truth, right? A guy can like, people can see things very, very differently, right? Even though you're like, well, these are the experts. I'm like, well, the experts are giving me conflicting information on this stuff. So I'm like, is there an expert? I'm like, that's why process is important, because I'm like, I don't know if there's truth. What there is process, and process can at least help you be consistent and help you reevaluate and iterate and improve. But like Drew Holiday was another one of these guys. Is like Drew, like there was a lot of chatter about his motivation because he wasn't like super engaged. He didn't have this like, he's a top, I don't think he was a consensus like 4th or 2nd, I don't know, whatever. He was like a top 5 RSCI guy, right? Like the super dudes. And he had like a just okay year with Ben Hallen and UCLA. Now Ben's gotten a reputation since then as being a guy that doesn't have prospects, like, produce stats. But like at the time it was like, well, it was a little underwhelming. And like, I'm not sure, what it is. And I was like, well, he knows that he's only going to be there for 1 year, right? Like, I don't know. I said, I don't know what the context was of the whole team and like how that was acting on his decision-making or whatever, but I certainly wasn't going to project out based on the data I had that was going to be some kind of like continuing thing. I'm like, well, let's see. I'm like, I'm going to bank on him because he had a lot of indicators that were like he had like the whatever Jimmy Butler falls. Like there's some things where I'm like, I see that, and it's not nothing's a guarantee. This stuff has errors, but I'm like, once you see some guys that have some things in common and they all tend to have like overachiever kind of like whatever, so like you start to get again, like Bartovic, not every guy on the list. And that doesn't mean but it's interesting to see who clusters together sometimes. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. That's a very interesting group of people, of 12 people that I might want to pay attention to this thing and like, and try to learn more. And I was just like, man, I think he's going to get to the pros. He's going to know that this is his career and he's not going anywhere. There's no like jumping the next year or whatever. And he's going to apply himself to like achievement, right? Like, I'm like, I don't think he's going to have a lackadaisical approach. Now, a player doesn't seem similar on the surface and that I can parallel that to two more, James Harden, similar conversations, didn't apply it the same way, didn't become a defensive by any stretch of the imagination, defensive savant, but people were like, I don't know about his motivation. He's done pretty, like, yes, long term, he didn't keep himself in the best shape, let's say, or whatever. But like when we're talking about draft stuff, I'm like, I don't think he's going to fail because he's disinterested in playing basketball and is not going to like get good. And then Kevin Love was the other one. I was in a big, very late night, like OJ Mayo, Kevin Love, like trade. I think the statute of limitations ended on that since everybody in both these organizations is gone. But like, that was like a thing, man. Right. And then OJ Mayo, like, who's just a much interesting case study and like, environmental pressures and all the expectation as like the next LeBron or whatever, right? Like, all that crap. But like Kevin Love was the third guy where it's like, I don't know how motivated he was because he was a little doughy, right? For a long time. Kevin Love, you wouldn't know that now. He looks like he's,
chiseled now.
He's been chiseled forever. But like, those three guys all had questions and they all had very similar indicators. And just looking at I don't even remember who I was paralleling them to from the guys that had already come in at the time. But I was just like, I'm like, I think that stuff is a lot more about just getting experience. I don't think it's going to be a blocker for them hitting their ceilings, basically was my advice. Right. I'm like, I think this is more about learning, gaining wisdom through experience. And then I'm like, I think these guys all want to achieve things. I don't think they're going to let their, I don't think they're going to let their weaknesses prevent them from achievement, basically and I've been wrong about tons of guys, which I was going to own up to when we were talking about the 2015 draft, is Mario Hezonja was one of those guys too. And I was like, he's going to hit like so hard. He had he was in the bin, like the guys you don't give up. Justice Winslow was another one, but Justice was actually good. He got hurt 3 million times. I'm not counting that one as an L when a guy goes on the injured list for like 70% of his first 5 years. But Mario Hezonja was definitely a whiff. I was like, he's got all the traits.
Yes. I'm sorry. I have to go because I don't have to go like let's leave the conversation. I have to go off of what you just said. Because I just saw like Hezonja. I was big on him too. Wasn't like gonna be a superstar, but definitely a really, really solid player. And like even I watched him last week on EuroLeague, and the dude is doing all the things. I'm like, again, it goes back to what you said, what we talked about earlier in terms of, I guess, context and team fit and who they are as a player and all those things. Because now 29, prime his career, kind of a semi-offensive engine, able to carry usage for a high rate. The shooting that didn't happen in the NBA that was talked about being there is back. Like all those things.
He got the reps. I remember going back through this one too, right? And John wrote a big piece on review, which I think bears mention, but like he didn't get a lot of reps before coming into the league because he barely played when he was on Real or whatever team he was on, right? He was like not a guy that got a lot of reps. So I think his developmental progress was retarded in terms of being able to execute. He definitely had the attitude, like he was aggressive, he was proactive, but he couldn't do the things, right? And it's good that you said that, like he's killing it and he's got, because I should go find and see how he's doing. I used to go look back all the time, but I remember distinctly one of the first people that like completely flipped my wig on remembering that like, oh, some of these things aren't permanent blockers, but like the continuum of a career, and guys get like, this is kind of, I should know this from baseball. Like sometimes guys become pros when they're 30, like not in basketball really. Like NBA doesn't do like, hey, let's call up a guy because he's finally ready. Like, and he can play for maybe like, we do this a little bit with like, it's starting to happen more with international guys at high levels. And they're just like, I don't care what age you are. You can play a projectable role right now. And you don't see too many guys get a second chance, which is interesting. I'm like, I wonder if Mario is like ready, and I'd have to watch. But like one of the things that was interesting is Anthony Randolph. I remember this was I worked with Golden State for a decade. Like I worked with Travis Slank forever. It's on my LinkedIn thing. I got
so cool
credit in the thing. It's like my highlight of my entire career. I should have asked for a ring in my contract. That would have been great. I joked about it. I didn't actually put it in.
Actually do it?
Now I feel like an asshole. Yeah. No, that was boy. But looking at what were we just talking
Anthony Randolph?
Yeah, Anthony Randolph. Anthony Randolph was a Golden State Warrior guy, and he had like, I'm gonna say flat. Like there were things where I'm like, I don't understand how this guy's motivated. I'd say he was in a very similar bin to D'Angelo Russell, which is a great lesson. And it's like, okay, look, there is definitely a trend in how teams draft and what traits. I wrote a whole opportunity bias thing and made a presentation. I'll share it with you offline. It's cool. Did it with a couple of stud guys that I cannot be named that work for NBA teams now before they were stars. But there is definitely a type that people gravitate to, right? There's a book called like How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? And like they're like charisma matters. Like people are biased towards people that are better at being charming than other people who are not as good at social cues, right? Like don't necessarily perceive things in a way that allows them to, I don't want to say brown nosing, but like even the subtle ability to adjust and understand and interpret information to like create opportunities. Draymond Green is a perfect example of this, right? He's in this group. He's got all those characteristics and you see how aggressive and all the crazy stuff that he's done, but like he's very perceptive. Yes. He didn't start day one and be like, hey, I'm going to punch my teammates in the face. Like he is extremely intelligent. He has that perceptivity. He worked, and as his station and his status increased, more elements of him were able to come out because he had power, right? It's kind of like in the same principles of like when people say like power corrupts or whatever, right? It's what you're really seeing is that once you have less constraints on you, more of yourself can show up. But while you're like climbing the food chain, the ability to self-moderate that stuff is huge. And so like, yeah, looking at Anthony Randolph and then seeing the point of that was like, then he was like a 2-time MVP of the EuroLeague or something. I was like, holy shit. He was like one of the highest paid players in Europe. He's on Barcelona, I think.
Just retired recently.
Yeah, but he was like a stud. And I was like, this was early. I think it might have been my first draft or one of them. I was like, this guy is going to fail. And I was correct in an NBA sense. But I was just like, no, this guy sucks and it's never going to happen. And I don't care how good his talent is. He became an absolute stud. He just wasn't ready. And that's a D'Angelo Russell like I said, put them in the business. D'Angelo Russell was able to survive and stay in the league. But in terms of that atypical growth trajectory, it just takes some guys longer. And unfortunately, because coaches have types, like the guys that are better at playing the game, not the game on the court, the game, right? Guys that are better. And this is the same in the corporate world and all that other stuff too. If you can communicate effectively, if you are perceptive and you understand what motivates the people around you and where you can win brownie points, and if you can do all that stuff, you are going to earn yourself more opportunities. And the guys that are more hardwired, they're more introverted, they're more like internally focused, Kawhi Leonard, right? Like these guys, like some of the obvious guys, the quiet ones, right? Like whatever, like, it doesn't always boil down like that, but like the dudes that are less perceptive are at a disadvantage for earning opportunities, irrespective of their actual performance on court. And that can have wrinkle effects, like we talked about, like the applied skills. Like some of that stuff is real, where you're like, you're not hearing me. I need you to do less of that. And you're like, whatever. Like that's a realistic cause for losing, playing time or opportunities or whatever. But like, it is tying that all back to character or whatever. Like it's stupid, and you have to understand more about the person, and then you have to really unpack and find those parallels where you can, and get as much detail as you can, because and then match them to the circumstances and create real projections for growth and development on that. And it's the hardest thing to do in the whole sport, but like at least half of the equation. I've been talking to Matt about this for a while, but I'm like, I want Swish Theory to do a like post draft like analysis piece or whatever after the board. Like once you know where everybody goes, the entire thing changes, in my opinion. Like, because we already know it, like the redraft thing. So I'm like, as soon as everyone's drafted, we should do a big reevaluation, be like, okay, so my guy is fucked. And we had him at 4. But now he's kind of like the 17th guy, not because he's any different, but because he just went to a team that has absolutely no projectable trajectory for him, right? Like because
Pistons and big men.
Yeah, it's so real. Yeah.
Wow. I didn't even think about that. That's a really cool idea of a project, because you're right. Like the immediate context almost immediately changes. And then you're right. Like from the media cycle, you have the mock draft, boom. You wait about, 4 or 5 months until maybe the first month of NBA season's done. And then maybe the second, if you're being more considerate. And then you do the redrafts of the mock drafts you did 5 months before, right? And you're right. Like, I think if you're going to do one that's early, an immediate one before they even play a game, given the context they now find themselves in, is really, really important because you're right. Like looking at a guy, a Cam Whitmore, I'm a Lakers fan, really high. He slipped as far as he did for all the reasons we don't really know. Maybe you have more insight than I would. Exactly. The quiet ones, exactly, right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And like the context he went to, he ended up doing well in Houston. I thought he would have shined well with the Lakers, where they took Jalen Hood-Schifino, which I didn't understand. And he didn't shine well with the Lakers. It just wasn't a fit for him. But again, team context, what they decided. But like, had there been a redraft immediately, Jalen Hood-Schifino probably got drafted in the right range for where he was going to be drafted, just not the right team within that range, right? Whereas a guy like a Cam Whitmore, who's projected high on a lot of boards, slipped dramatically there, and a redraft might have still had him pretty high.
No, I think it's a really good exercise because that fits in the process. And when we were talking about the redraft again, it's like those redrafts tend to again focus on the player, and like the exercise of immediately going back into it's almost like doing the season preview part of the cycle, right? Like the media cycle, right? But you're like combining the two things where it's still focused on the draft, but now you're evaluating the team for the context of the player, right? Instead of reevaluating the player. It's like, no, now we know the context. Let's do a quick reevaluation and then like resort these guys just as a fun exercise because it's not a reflection of where they rank as a prospect now. Now you're kind of just like redoing it in terms of like outcome probability or whatever, right? You're just like, okay, so we went to this team and I really don't like X, Y, and Z. I have no idea what they're doing, right? I call it like organizational direction is huge. It's like, well, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you in like the 2-year like going for it thing? Because that's going to influence like free agency decision. Like that's going to influence a lot of what I call blockers, right? Because young guys typically aren't ready to contribute large roles, right? A great example of this, which is really interesting. Another guy, shout out to Schmitz up in Portland for like, well, basically agreeing with me from all of the Hoop Summit things, but Peyton Pritchard, right? Like he senior, like not very big guy, scrappy. I had watched him. He was on the whatever the equivalent of the Washington Generals team is that the USA select team beats up on during practice at Hoop Summit, and then like the last year he was on the USA team. So like, right, like I watched him a lot, and I really liked, everything you see about him, right? He's a feisty, like he's just a baller, man. But he's small and he's whatever. But he got blocked, and right, his minutes were in retrograde for his first 3 years, right? And whatever for reasons, like they acquired people that blocked him, and you'd be like, oh, okay, and it's not a bust at like 30 or whatever, but you start looking at that and you're like, oh, he's, I guess he's not good enough to do whatever. It's like, but the circumstance dictated that you weren't really giving growth opportunity, right? You weren't prioritizing that. There was bigger priorities for building the roster, but then in year 4, lo and behold, they give him an extension instead of getting rid of him. They create space for him to play, and he has his best season and definitely looks like he's going to outplay that $7.5 million annual that he got. And it's like, well, what happened there? Well, you got to pay attention, right? Was the guy worse? It wasn't that he couldn't separate on shot or any of the stuff that was pre. Was he big enough to get his shot off? I'm like, that dude stops on a dime. That guy will be able to get shots off, and he's strong. I'm like, he creates separation on his shot, and he can shoot from like 40 feet. I'm like, it wasn't dudes are swallowing him up. It's circumstantial, right? It was like, it just wasn't designed. The roster was not prioritizing him getting meaningful time until year 4. And then boom, 22 minutes a game, and he has his best year, and people are like, holy shit, I can't believe he's an NBA player. And I'm from Boston, so I constantly get messages. That's where you see a lot of my Twitter skew, a lot of what I do to respond back to all of the nutsy family members and friends that hit me with psycho nonsense all the time. I'm like, I'll just put it on Twitter. I'm not answering. I'll just give my thoughts there, so you stop asking me. Like, it's really annoying. Boston sports fans are rough, and yeah. And, and they come out in legion. So I typically use Twitter a lot to basically group message like everybody. I'm like, this is what I thought about this, and this is what I did. And he was a big one. I think at the beginning of the year, I did one of my rare like film thread ones, and I'm like, check out all this. And this is before he started like really doing well. But I was like, man, look at this kid driving now, and look at the separation he's creating with because he's a compact. He's like a little mini Drew Holiday, right? He is a thick, like compact, like he's not a
good center of gravity.
65, like he can't campaign. I'll just say that, right? Like
no.
No, like this kid hits you and you like,
You feel that.
You come off. He gets layups on dudes on like footwork and like little bumps that you're like, dude,
volleyball action.
Like he does some sneaky stuff, which is why Mike liked him because he's a scrapper. He's like, he can shoot. He's a hooper. So like, that's the kind of interesting stuff. Like when you're looking, it's like, never give up on people, always continue to collect information over that 3 to 5 year period of time. And with a very deliberate focus on avoiding the evaluation bias, going back to that thing, by making sure that you are first asking like, was this situation helpful in any way for the outcome I projected? Because like, that's in my experience, like at least half the guys that move on a redraft are not redistributing up and down the redraft board because they sucked or whatever, or they were way better than people thought. Like at least half of those guys, if not more, going back to the bell curve thing. I mean, honestly, I think it's a majority of them. I think less than 10% of players fail because of inherent flaws, right? I think most of it is just like, yep, wasn't in a good situation, wasn't a significant like talent above replacement or whatever, right? Like it wasn't the investment in like, oh, we gotta get Peyton Pritchard. Like most teams aren't gonna be like, holy shit, they're gonna be like, hey, we get a draft every year and we could just get a new version of this. And then you want instant gratification on those signals. Like we'll just, like waiting for the stars to align or whatever for some of these guys to get the opportunity that they need to succeed. And when you think about it like that, like the new CBA is really interesting because I'm hopeful that the emphasis on internal development will provide more critical pathways, right? Like more thinking about that, because like you'll need better ROI out of your cost controlled players because of the penalties, right? Like, which has usually been the area reserved for shit lottery teams, right? It's like, oh, well, we're focused on development. And then most of the guys that get screwed are the teams that are ready to go for it and make moves. They instantly just start blocking and start stacking contracts and, veteran contracts in front of guys or trading guys or whatever. Now that there's like real penalties for doing that, basically you can, like, I call it snookering yourself, right? Like you can just build yourself into a corner where you don't, like, look at Phoenix. Like, I don't think there's any context where like they can get better. Sure. Like, but they're not good. Like you got swept by Minnesota. Not the way. Like Minnesota's good, but like swept by Minnesota, like they got problems. If you just pay money and you don't have like exit strategy things, right? Like, you can trade, Booker and KD have value, whatever. But like, I think there'll be a lot more purpose. I'm hopeful that there'll be a lot more purposefulness in player development and more like thinking in terms of 4-year plans for not just high picks on bad teams, but like role players, right? Guys that can fill legitimate rotation spots, being able to actually, because they're way more cost effective. Let's be honest. Like if you're looking at salary, which every business does all the time, it's like, well, if I re-sign a guy or do an extension with a dude that I can see playing as a 6th through 8th man in my rotation forever, well, hell yeah. Look, Dene Avdija, he just got signed for like, that contract's ridiculous. That's maybe the best value contract in the NBA. He's being paid $35 million or something for 4 years. He just had an amazing season and his team sucks. That's a perfect player, that example that I'm like, oh, imagine what he could do in a, like, as a plugged in hub for doing stuff on a team that makes sense versus like, hey, we're in the middle of like figuring out. That guy's a system player. If I've ever seen one, playing in no
without a system right now.
Yeah. Like, so like, I think that the draft and the post-draft player development, I think these things are married. We all like to follow our binkies, right? Like we're all like, hey, like Chet Holmgren. Everybody loves Chet Holmgren. Like, but like continuing the evaluation process purposefully instead of just rooting for our guys and then doing like kind of snapshot reevals. I think that's like the biggest thing going forward into this draft.
I like that. Which I was going to say in closing out, because we've had but first of all, Eric, thank you again for your time. It's been a great kind of dive into I think we've been both macro and micro on the kind of different endpoints and different I don't even know what I'd say, like, I guess case studies in this case about looking at philosophy and eval, but taking it from more general and not even applying it specifically to any particular prospects, but to this class as a whole, right? We've heard storylines about this not being a very deep class, right? And deep in terms of talent at the top that's a star. And I mean, I'm sure you've already just even in casually looking, seen like, it's not really like, it's nowhere Victor Wembanyama here, right?
Yep.
But what is like 1 or 2 points you'd like to kind of leave with us listeners here, kind of as far as looking at this draft class with an eye beyond just the immediate storyline bullet points?
Yeah. I think that applying, and sorry, Corban, for giving you a ton of editing work to do on YouTube. Hopefully we gave you tons of shorts for helping promote the thing. The long form one might be a little aggressive for everybody, but there's plenty of segments in this thing.
There's a lot. It's gonna be fun.
I think that the application of a lot of the stuff that we talked about is going to be the most interesting to me. So like, I'll bring up a couple of guys that are interesting. Reed Shepherd, obviously high projection, but like controversial because like the production and the like kind of vibe that he gives, like runs counter to like whatever measurement modeling based stuff. Right. And I think that he's going to be fascinating because I think that he's a lock to be a productive player. And I've seen like the comps, but a lock in terms of I reserve the right to completely change my mind depending on where he goes. Right. I'm like,
of course.
I know that he has what it takes. That goes into the whole dichotomy, right? Because I'm like, it's not going to be him that fails. It is going to be the circumstances in which he's placed in that will determine his floor and ceiling. Like he has everything I need to know that he is like, I can't say he's gonna be a superstar, whatever, but like, I'm like, he's at least a starting caliber player in my mind. If you give him a net neutral like circumstance, and if you plug him in the right way, I think that he can be a significant impact. And it's the best time ever for a player like this because you don't need him to be your primary ball handler or any of these things. You can have a single positional defender or whatever, right? Like in the right context that can make plays and do all these things. If you have like Toronto is actually interesting as a projection, right? Because if you have a center or whatever forward being your point guard, then you can have like a shooter, playmaker, connector, whatever. You can have like this, like a baller playing at the small position, right? Like that creates an interesting context. Stephen Castle is another one of my biggies. Everything that I see about him, all of the intel I pull, like I'm like, this guy screams like the Jimmy Butler, like whatever. That's the upside one, and comps downside, but like Jimmy Butler, I'm gonna say Jay Crowder. It's not a perfect, but like the bins that I put guys in, dudes that will just fucking grind and max what they have and do winning shit. So like any team that is competent, which I think are better outcome environments for non whatever on ball guaranteed pump, like non number one scoring, easy projection things, right? Like any team will kind of create opportunity for dudes that put it in the bucket. But if you have a guy that just like does good shit, I want him to be in a better team, a balance between a team that has like bottom 3 rotation opportunity in it, right? So you can establish where, like, for me, he's one where I'm just like, I'm all in on him. I'm like, nope. I'm like, it's not going to happen overnight. Didn't happen with Jimmy Butler overnight. I'm like, he's going to constantly get better, like every year of his career, as long as he doesn't get injured and he goes to a place that like creates space to value what he does and gives him room to evolve. Like he's a high one. And then the last guy that I have go a little bit further down the draft board, Tyler Kolek. I like him, but I'm not going to go nuts on draft stuff right now. Deron Holmes. He's an interesting one. And interesting that he's projected in a range where Minnesota and Denver and Utah are picking because they're all very good at this game. But which is perfect. Sometimes I used to, when I sat around in Chicago all the time doing all the stuff with like agents and players, I would often emphasize to these guys. I think the last guy I told this to, and he's like, who the fuck are you guys? It's a CAA thing. And I was like, Donovan Mitchell. I'm like, just did an interview and was like, dude, it's all going to work out. I'm like, this is going to be great. Doesn't matter where you go. I'm like, I should have been more aggressive. I was like, I think you're a top 10 player in this. And this is, like, I don't have any proof of this other than Donovan knows this is true. But he was just looking at me like, who the fuck are you? It's just like standing there with John when they're doing the interviews. And I was like, I'm like, you got all these things, right? But like, I used to say this stuff all the time. I'm like, where you go matters. And Deron Holmes is interesting to me because I think that a lot of the typical stuff, he's older, less strength of competition, all this, but like, and he doesn't have such an amazing physique that he like really defended. Like he's another one. He's got this tweener stuff. Like there's a lot of like gray areas in 3 bins that make people unsure of stuff. I think he's going to climb the boards in workouts and stuff because like he'll start just killing people that like have better pedigree or whatever, right? Like I don't think he will fail to impress when teams have them under their control. And he's a guy that that's just like speculation short term. Like I would bet that he is a solid first round projection by the time we get to actual decision-making time, which is I guess what we'll leave with is this process isn't over. We might have all the film and workouts have whatever, they're basically job interviews, whatever, private workouts or private visits or whatever. But they do matter for small things. Like you can concentrate things. For instance, if you haven't seen a guy rep out on a lot of shooting stuff, like you can create drills where like the film hasn't shown you a lot of like pull-up shooting or whatever, right? But you can like get that in, or you can do whatever. There's a lot of things. And then you get the interviews and stuff. But I think Deron Holmes, I'll leave that as the last one. He's a guy that I definitely have my eyes on, because all of the evidence outside of the stuff like, yeah, I got questions about his position. Yeah, I got questions about his level of competition. Yeah, he's a little bit older. I'm like, the actual productivity and the stuff that I see when he's doing it, I'm like, okay, I got a fluid dude that can shoot and has like good size and length. I'm like, and was very productive. I'm like, he moves well. He plays well.
Yeah.
Like he's got good measurements. I'm like, I'm good with him. So that's my
okay with that.
Guys. I say 2 guys that are much more highly heralded, and one like, I don't know, it's not necessarily a dark horse now, and shout out to Nima for putting him on my radar last year when I was putting the library thing together, because I was watching a lot of guys. You guys were doing all my homework for me last year, and I very quickly was like, oh, I like this kid. And so, yeah. So shout out to Nima. That's the only reason I know who Deron Holmes is because of Nima.
That is what's up. Yeah, Nima, he's one of them guys. I got a lot of guys, a lot of people in Swish Theory. One of them dudes for sure. But that's awesome. I mean, for real, I'm about to give you a moment to plug both your work and the good work of Swish Theory real quick. But I first want to say thank you so much for coming on, Eric. Just like you said about the evaluation not being done, us doing this pods, especially during the season, with your insight, hopefully it's not over. I would love to have you on again and continue having more of these kind of contextualization conversations, maybe some retrospectives with some that are well past the 3-year window. I see a lot of fun conversations here in the future with you. But before I let you go, I would like you to share, what you can share of what you have been kind of up to, what you're doing, and then also chance to plug, like you said, the good folks at Swish Theory.
Yeah. Well, shout out to Swish Theory first and foremost. It took me a long time to stop just talking to my peers that I grew up in the industry with. It's been an absolute revelation to actually start networking and connecting with like the next generation, like yourself and all the guys at Swish Theory. It's been like rejuvenating to kind of go back and remember the energy of like how it's starting, and from a website and everything. There's so many parallels to like the DX heyday that just makes me all warm and fuzzy inside, just being with a bunch of smart guys that love the sport. And in terms of professional stuff, say anybody that's into coaching should check out Luceo Sports. A lot of good things going on there in terms of development. We're going to have a major software release in hopefully by the end of this month. And then we're kind of in stealth mode with Crowd Scout, but I'll just say Crowd Scout. And that's going to be the Swish Theory crew's little baby for doing a lot of the things that I really hope to bring to the table in terms of making a real mark in what we can do. That's my baby. It's my pet project that I've been working on that ties all of those contextual things that we were talking about. This is like my swing at this and the thing I've wanted to do for probably 10 years. So stay tuned.
Wow. Oh yes, please. It's game changing. That's all I know. That's all I know. But listen, thank you again, Eric. You can follow me all on Twitter at Corban NBA. We've worked with Swish Theory as well. Just going into the draft, roster reconstruction. The show will be out a lot more regularly, both off-season preview stuff. I plan on writing a few pieces onto that as well, and then also having folks like Eric having draft guys on and guys with experience in player development and scouting on a deeper level, because I do want to have more of these conversations as we kind of explore the 2024 class in depth. So stay tuned for that as well. Make sure to check out Swish Theory as usual at Swish Theory on Twitter, swishtheory.com, all the great work there. And yeah, a lot's going to be coming up the pipeline, a lot of fun stuff here. Keep watching the playoffs. Stay tuned for all of that. But that'll do it here for this episode of Roster Construction. Just want to thank Eric Weiss again for coming on and giving your time and insight, man. I really do appreciate you. And thank anyone who listens, both on the podcast and later on the YouTube. We get that up there. That'll be fun for sure. But as I always say, for Eric, for myself, we are Frosty. Y'all stay frosty, and we'll talk to y'all real soon.
Thanks, man.
All right.